I want to talk about a handful of other structural issues just to be aware of. And again, hopefully all of you have seen these in the transactions that you consummated. But working capital issues are always usually a critical concern. I say always. I literally just had a conversation yesterday with a former client that sold their business, and there were no working capital provisions in the agreement, oddly enough. But at the date you enter into a term sheet with a target until the date that you close a transaction, the risk that you have is that they suck all the cash out of the business and leave all the liabilities, and you end up assuming a balance sheet that you have to fund in order to have a viable business. That effectively results in additional purchase price. Now, the converse of that is maybe you get lucky and you inherit a balance sheet that looks wonderful, right? The owners didn't take any of the cash out. But you don't want to roll the dice and just hope that you get lucky in that regard. So what we typically see is some sort of working capital threshold established in the agreement, and there's some settlement mechanism that allows the parties to step back shortly after closing, determine whether or not that threshold was achieved. If they fall short, your purchase price is reduced, so you still maintain the relative ROI that you thought you were getting. If you go above it, that's a little bit of a question mark. Obviously the seller's motivation is, look, if we're going to leave extra cash in the business above that threshold, we want additional purchase price. Say it's a flip of a coin. A lot of times we see transactions that are only one-sided on working capital measurements, so they only work to your benefit if you're an acquirer. But I'd say it's relatively common to see them try to push back and make sure that they get the overage. The flip is that if you don't have contractual language that provides them with the upside, that they get paid the excess, they can take cash out of the business before closing to get them to the same spot. The point is that you want to be careful. I'm going to have the same comment on the next slide when we talk about earnouts. You have to be very careful about the definitions that are used for these measurements. For working capital, is it on a GAAP basis? And guess what? On a GAAP basis, the number could differ. So one of the situations that we're currently dealing with is a client that had a working capital measurement formula. It said it's determined on a GAAP basis. Well, historically, the seller measured their allowance for doubtful accounts based on an analysis of specific delinquent accounts. They had no general reserve percentages that they applied to the aging buckets. The acquirer had a formula of applying percentages to the aging buckets, and this company, just based on the profile of their customers, tended to have a lot of old receivables that ultimately were collected. So those types of issues weren't thought about when they defined working capital under the agreement, and there was no mechanism to settle it. So what happens now if the buyer says, well, we think the reserve should be higher, so your working capital was too low? What happens if they collect those receivables down the line? Does the seller get the benefit of that cash? There was no real thought given to that, and we commonly see that. So is it GAAP? Is it cash? Is it on a basis consistent with past practice or not? And what are the dispute resolution processes in the event that you aren't able to come to agreement? And one other thing just to think about practically is, can you actually comply with the timing? We've seen transactions where they say working capital is going to be measured at the closing table. I don't have a single client, nor have I ever seen one in my history of being a CPA that can tell you what their working capital is on that day. So, think about whether it's practical, especially, again, if you are dealing with a seller that will have a continuing role in management, because your biggest risk is conflict between you and the seller. Their lives are going to change after the transaction. They had some span of authority before the closing. That span of authority is now limited. So that in and of itself is going to create conflict. If you now have economic issues that were fuzzy or variable, and that creates conflict, you run the risk of damaging a relationship. And we already talked about the risk of employee losses and things like that, but there's going to be somebody in the back of the room at that company that's going to say at the date of closing, they're a bunch of idiots, they don't know what they're doing. And what you don't want to do is have that voice get loud. And what you really don't want to have happen is for that voice to be somebody that's sitting in a management role. So the clearer you can make these types of definitions and, the dispute resolution process. All right, earnouts and clawbacks. Hopefully everybody's somewhat familiar with earnouts. That's contingent purchase price that you get in the event that you exceed some predefined target. So in a typical case, the seller thinks their business is worth $15 million, you think it's worth 10. They think it's worth 15 because they're going to generate a lot more revenue from some new products that they recently introduced. So you can set up an earnout arrangement under which if they achieve some higher level of revenues after the closing date, they get additional purchase consideration. The flip of that is a clawback, where you paid them more than you thought the business was worth, but you get to get that money back in the event that they miss the targets. We rarely see clawbacks. That's something that I threw up there from a theoretical perspective. I can't remember the last time I saw a transaction with legitimate clawbacks other than indemnification provisions and things like that. just be mindful of the fact that earnouts can be a huge impediment to integration. A lot of times your synergies, so your cost synergies, your revenue synergies, depend on merging the combined business operations. So the problem with earnouts is that if they're measured based on post-transaction revenue of the sold business, how are you going to track that, right? You're going to you want to integrate them in your general ledger. You don't want a standalone entity anymore. Well, you can't do that because you're going to have to track them separately. How are you going to deal with cross-selling? This was one that I ran into in industry. So we merged these businesses together, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail when we talk about culture. But the goal was to cross-sell services from one of the entities to the other. Well, the problem was that the entity that was ultimately the customers that were sold to, the management team felt that they should get credit for those revenues. Well, they didn't generate those revenues. They were sold by one of the other subsidiaries. Well, that subsidiary wanted the credit for the earn-out purposes on theirs. So again, gets back to the practical issues. Can you live with the structure of an earn-out, and can you live with it for as long as it's defined in the agreement? One of my clients has a 3-year earn-out that they're working through right now. That's a really long period to have to live with tracking that, and it creates 3 years of potential disputes between the buyer and the seller. They work okay if you're dealing with a seller that's not involved in the business after the date of the sale. If they're going to be involved, there may be some risk, again, to the non-compete agreements. Again, this is something that's typically addressed. We don't really see this overlooked, but you have to identify who the key management team members are, who the key owners are. The good news is that unlike employment agreements with most of your core employees, the courts seem to look very favorably on non-compete agreements that are executed in connection with the sale of a business, because they view that as the owner took consideration for the sale of the business, and they will not allow that owner to undermine the value of the business. So you tend to get a little bit longer terms than you typically can get with an employee, and they tend to be more enforceable. Dispute resolution, we just talked about that. Make sure that there is a clear, practicable approach to resolving disputes between the parties. The case that I just mentioned about working capital, so what happens if the buyer collects the receivables? Nobody knows, right? So if the buyer takes an aggressive position and says, I don't care, the formula was what it was, as of that measurement date, your working capital was too low, I'm reducing the purchase price, and the seller disagrees, what are they going to do? They're going to sue each other? Does it define that arbitration's the process? Does it say that a party like us would come in there and remeasure at a later date? Does it say that you'd hand over those receivables to the seller if you disqualified them? You need to think through the details. Far too often, the dispute resolution and the definitions in the agreement are things that are drafted by people that haven't dealt with the accounting side of the issues. So they don't work the transaction.